There are stories that sound like they were invented in a writer's room, too clean, too cinematic, too perfectly timed. And yet they happen in the messy, ordinary corners of history where nobody is looking. So let me ask you to imagine something. Imagine you're 17 years old, not a soldier, not a spy with a gun and a fake passport, just a seamstress with calloused fingers and a head full of numbers and street names. Imagine the world around you is occupied, rationed, patrolled, and hungry. Imagine men in uniforms decide whether your father gets to come home, whether your brother gets to breathe, whether your neighbors get to keep their shop. And now imagine that your needle, your tiny, harmless needle, becomes the sharpest weapon you have. Because stitched into the seams of those same uniforms are maps. And stitched into those maps is a plan that could save lives, or get you executed before dinner. I'm going to tell you the story of a teenage tailor who hid intelligence in hems and outsmarted a whole battalion. And the terrifying part is this: the battalion never suspected her, not because they were stupid, but because they were certain of something that felt obvious. To them, they were sure they knew what a girl like her could and could not be, and that certainty became their blind spot. Now, before we get into the close calls and the inspection that almost unraveled everything, we have to start where every dangerous story starts, with something small, with a job, with a doorway, with a decision that looks harmless when you make it. Her name, at least the name we'll use here, was Eliza Hart. The year was 1943. The place was a river town that sat like a knot on the supply lines, the kind of place armies love because roads converge and trains stop in. Warehouses grow fat. The people called it Ridgeford because that's where it lived, wedged between a ridge and a wide gray river that never stopped moving, even when everything else in the world felt frozen. Ridgeford had a mill, a rail depot, a market square, and one narrow street where the local trade survived on stubbornness. A baker, a cobbler, a barber, and a tailor shop that smelled of wool, steam, and chalk. The tailor shop belonged to Eliza's mother. It had been in the family for years, the kind of place where men came to have their Sunday coats repaired and women brought dresses that were too precious to throw away. But under occupation, the shop changed. Customers changed. Work changed. Orders arrived with official stamps. And when official stamps arrive, you learn quickly that you don't have a choice about whether you take the job, you only get to choose how you survive. The occupiers needed uniforms altered and mended. They needed trousers let out because men were gaining weight from better rations. They needed cuffs replaced and buttons restitched and collars tightened. They needed patches repaired so they could look sharp while they took what they wanted. And Eliza's mother, like most people trying to keep a roof over their heads, said yes. Not because she wanted to, because saying no would have been its own kind of death. Eliza, meanwhile, had grown up in that shop. She knew fabric the way some kids know baseball stats. She could tell you the difference between gabardine and serge by touch. She could thread a needle in the dark. She could stitch straight seams faster than most adults, because she'd learned early that speed meant heat in the stove and bread on the table. She had a quiet face, one of those faces that doesn't invite questions, and that mattered more than she understood at 17. But Eliza had another skill, a skill that didn't belong in a tailor shop. She was good with maps. Her father had been a surveyor before the war. He used to bring home rolled paper that smelled like ink and grass and rain. He'd show her contour lines and teach her how to read the land like a language. A hill isn't just a hill, he'd say, tapping the paper. It's a promise. It tells you where water will run and where a man can hide. Eliza loved that. She loved the idea that the world had patterns, that you could look at chaos and find order. Then the occupation came, and her father disappeared into it the way people do, first as a rumor, then as a silence. One day he was late. The next day he was missing. There were whispers. Questioned, arrested, taken for work. Nobody had proof. Nobody had answers. Eliza's mother stopped waiting by the window. Eliza stopped asking out loud. And the shop kept running because grief doesn't pay rent. In that kind of world, resistance doesn't usually begin with hero speeches. It begins with errands, with note passing, with small, stupid risks that add up until you're in too deep to climb out. It started for Eliza with thread. A woman came into the shop one afternoon with a bundle of linens. She looked like the kind of customer Eliza's mother had always served. Practical shoes, hair pinned tight, hands rough from work. She asked for repairs, spoke politely, and then, while Eliza's mother was in the back, she placed a spool of blue thread on the counter. "This one," she said softly. "Use this one for the hem. It holds." Eliza didn't think anything of it until later when she took the spool to the work table. The label was old and cracked, but there was a mark on it, a tiny ink dot in the corner that didn't belong. Eliza turned it over and there it was again. 2 dots, then 3, like a code. Eliza's heart did that strange thing it does when your life pivots without warning. It slowed down and sped up at the same time. She stared at the spool as if it might bite her. Then she did what she'd learned to do under occupation. She acted normal. That night, when her mother was asleep, Eliza carefully unspooled a few yards of thread. Woven into the twist, nearly invisible, was a thin strand of paper so thin it felt like a dried leaf. Eliza's fingers trembled as she teased it out. The paper was rolled tight, no wider than a matchstick. She unrolled it with the care of a bomb technician. It was a map, not a full map, a fragment, a corner of something larger, but Eliza recognized it instantly. The ridge, the river bend, the rail spur near the depot, and the narrow road that ran behind the barracks. There were marks on it, tiny X's and a line that curved like a question. Eliza sat there in the dark, listening to the stove creak, and realized 2 things at once. First, someone trusted her. Second, someone had made a mistake, because trusting her meant she was now in danger. The next day the woman returned. She didn't ask for her linens, she asked for Eliza. "My husband used to work with your father," she said when Eliza stepped outside. "He said you know how to read the land." Eliza didn't answer. Under occupation, words were expensive. The woman continued anyway, as if the silence was permission. "We need someone who can move information without looking like information. We need someone who can put a map where no one thinks to look. And you," she glanced at Eliza's hands, "you've been putting secrets into seams your whole life." Eliza wanted to say no. She wanted to laugh. She wanted to run back inside and lock the door and pretend this conversation never happened. But then the woman said the sentence that changed everything. "They took your father because he measured the roads." And just like that, Eliza's anger found a shape. The resistance fell in. Ridgeford was small, not glamorous, not the kind of thing movies celebrate. It was a few people who had decided that surrender felt worse than risk. They needed intelligence. Where the patrols went, where the trucks parked, when the trains ran, which bridges were guarded, which roads were mined. In other words, they needed maps. But maps were dangerous. A map in your pocket could get you shot. A map in your shoe could get you tortured. A map in your house could get your whole family taken away. So the woman, her name was Mara, had an idea. Hide the maps in the thing the occupiers would never stop touching: their own uniforms. It sounds impossible, doesn't it? Like a plan you'd think of in a panic. But that's exactly why it worked, because it played on arrogance. A battalion expects sabotage from men in forests, from bombs under rails, from strangers at the edge of town. It does not expect sabotage from the girl who fixes their buttons. Here's how it worked. The resistance would sketch micromaps small enough to fit into a seam allowance. They'd use onion skin paper, thin as a whisper. They'd ink it with a pencil and then seal it with wax so sweat wouldn't smear it. The maps weren't just drawings, they were instructions. This ditch, this culvert, this patrol time, this shortcut through the reeds. Then Eliza would stitch those fragments into hems, collars, and inside pockets, places that would pass inspection because they looked normal. The uniform left the shop. It went back to the barracks. And when the right messenger came, sometimes a laundry woman, sometimes a clerk, sometimes a bored soldier flirting with the wrong person, the fragment would be retrieved and brought to the people who needed it. Eliza's job was simple in theory, so, in practice it meant living in a constant state of controlled fear. Because every uniform that came through that door was a test. Every time boots clomped on the floorboards, Eliza had to decide whether she was about to die. Every time a soldier leaned over the counter and made a joke, she pretended not to understand. She wondered if he could see through her like fabric held to the light. The first week nearly broke her. A sergeant came in with a tear in his sleeve. Eliza's mother greeted him with the careful politeness of someone who knows her position. Eliza kept her eyes down. The sergeant complained about the cold, about these miserable towns, about the way his men couldn't get decent tobacco. And then he looked at Eliza and said, "You're young, you should smile, it's good for morale." Eliza smiled, not the smile of a girl, the smile of a mirror, empty, reflective, giving him what he wanted to see. He laughed and turned away, satisfied. And Eliza realized something. The uniform wasn't the only disguise in the room. The second week she made her first real drop. It was an officer's coat, heavy wool, brass buttons that caught the light like little suns. The resistance fragment was a simple strip. This time, an updated patrol schedule and a note about a truck convoy that would move on Thursday at dawn. Eliza slid the paper into the seam allowance along the inner lining, stitched it shut, and pressed it flat. It looked perfect. It looked ordinary. It looked harmless. When the officer returned to collect it, he brought two men with him. They stood in the shop like furniture, hands behind their backs, watching. Eliza's mother chatted nervously about the weather. The officer tried on the coat, flexed his arm, and nodded. Then he glanced at Eliza. "Good work," he said, as if he were praising. "A tool." Eliza swallowed and kept her face calm. Inside, her heart was slamming against her ribs so hard she thought it might tear the lining open by itself. The officer paid, left, and the bell above the door stopped ringing. Eliza collapsed onto a stool, hands shaking. Her mother stared at her. "Are you sick?" Eliza wanted to tell her. She wanted to pour the secret into her mother's lap like spilled thread. But she couldn't. The resistance had been clear. The fewer people who knew, the fewer people who could be forced to talk. So Eliza said, "Just tired." And in that lie she began to understand the real cost. It wasn't just the risk of death. It was the loneliness of carrying it. Over the next months, Eliza became the cell's quiet engine. She learned to work fast and normal. She learned to hide the pause in her breath when a new order arrived. She learned to stitch with steady hands even when her stomach was hollow from rationing. She learned to burn scraps in the stove so no one could find pencil marks. She learned to keep a second set of fake notes, on her table so that if someone searched the shop, the only maps they'd find were harmless pattern templates for clothing. And she learned something else too: soldiers talk. They talk in front of women because they assume women are background noise. They brag, they complain, they show off. They say things like, "We're moving the whole battalion north after the harvest," or "Command is furious about that." Bridge, or "Keep your head down on the river road, there's a minefield now." Eliza listened as if she were listening to fabric prices. She stored the words in the same careful part of her mind where she stored measurements. Then, when Mara came to pick up repairs, Eliza would pass the information. The way she passed pins, casually, quickly, without drama. At 17, she became something older than 17, but every system has a weak point. And for Eliza, the weak point was always going to be the day someone looked too closely. That day arrived in late autumn, when the river turned steel, and the mornings smelled like smoke. The battalion stationed in Ridgeford had a new quartermaster, Lieutenant Haller. He was young, ambitious, and obsessed with order. The kind of man who believed chaos was a personal insult. He instituted inspections. He counted supplies. He lectured men about cleanliness. He made the local businesses fill out forms in triplicate. And because he was the quartermaster, he cared about uniforms. One morning, 2 soldiers arrived at the tailor shop with a stack of coats. Not one or two, a stack. They dropped them on the counter like a threat. "Repairs, 1. Soldier said, "All by Friday." Eliza's mother's face tightened. Friday is the soldier shrugged. Orders. And then the second soldier, quieter, said, there's going to be a uniform inspection. Lieutenant Haller thinks someone's been stealing cloth. Eliza felt her blood run cold. Stealing cloth was the excuse. The inspection was the real danger, because an inspection meant seams opened, linings checked, pockets turned out. An inspection meant hands running along hems in a way that might catch the unnatural stiffness of wax paper. It meant a careful man might notice a stitch that didn't belong. Eliza's mother protested, but protest is a language occupation doesn't understand. The soldiers left. The bell rang. The shop suddenly felt too small. That night, Mara came through the back door, as she always did when things were urgent. Eliza, she said, not bothering with pleasantries. They're tightening up, Eliza nodded. I heard. Mara placed a hand on the work table and leaned forward. We have to get everything out. No more fragments in the shop. No more pencil marks. No thread spools. Nothing. Eliza's mouth went dry. What about the coats already in the barracks? Mara's eyes flicked, and Eliza saw fear there for the first time. That's the problem. Because there were coats. There were already coats carrying information that hadn't been retrieved yet, and now those coats might be inspected. Eliza's mind raced the way it did when she looked at a map. She pictured the barracks, the laundry room, the inspection line. She pictured Lieutenant Haller's sharp eyes. She pictured a seam ripped open and a tiny rolled strip of paper falling like a confession. And then she realized the only advantage she had. She understood uniforms better than the quartermaster did. The next morning, Eliza went to work as if nothing was wrong. She stitched hems. She replaced buttons. She measured sleeves. She kept her face calm. But inside her, a plan formed, simple, risky, and almost insulting in how ordinary it looked. She would use the inspection itself as cover. Here's what Eliza knew. Inspections are about control, but they are also about theater. Officers want to show that they are vigilant. Men want to get through it quickly. Nobody wants delays. Nobody wants to be the soldier whose uniform causes trouble and extends the ordeal. Which means that if you can make a uniform look like it will pass without issue, it usually will, especially if you can distract the inspector at the right moment. Eliza also knew something else. Soldiers hate uncomfortable uniforms. They complain about collars that itch, about seams that rub, about cuffs that pinch. And a good seamstress can fix that. Which meant in the days before inspection, soldiers would come begging for last-minute adjustments. So Eliza did what she always did. She waited. On Wednesday, it happened. A corporal arrived with an officer's coat and a nervous expression. Can you fix this by tomorrow? He asked. The lieutenant wants everything perfect. Eliza examined the coat, heavy wool, inner lining, and if she was lucky, one of the coats carrying a fragment. She took it, heart steady, and said, of course. That night, after her mother went to bed, Eliza locked the shop, pulled the coat under the lamp, and began carefully opening the inner seam with a small blade. Her hands were so steady it surprised even her. There it was, a rolled strip, waxed and tight. She removed it and unrolled it just enough to confirm what it contained. An updated sketch of a bridge guard rotation, and a note that the battalion had placed a machine gun nest near the reed path. This couldn't be found. People would die. Eliza had to get it out, but she couldn't hand it to Mara normally. The streets were watched. The back door was risky. Haller had eyes everywhere, so she did something that sounds ridiculous until you realize how brilliant it was. She hid the map in plain sight, in the only place no soldier would search thoroughly during inspection. She hid it in the stitching itself. Eliza took a length of thread and split it carefully, separating strands until she had a thin, hollow twist. Then she rolled the map fragment tighter than before, so thin it looked like a sliver of bark, and she inserted it into the hollow thread. Then she rewound the thread around a spool, smearing a little wax to seal it and make it look like an old, stiff thread. To anyone else, it was just a spool of thread. To Eliza, it was a lifesaver. Now she needed to get that spool out of the shop and into Mara's hands without anyone suspecting. So she used the one thing occupation could never fully control: routine. On Thursday morning, the same laundry woman who collected uniforms for washing came in to pick up a bundle of mended items. She was an older woman named Tilda, known for complaining loudly about soap and stains. Soldiers disliked her. That was perfect. People avoid what annoys them. Eliza handed Tilda the bundle and with her other hand, casually placed the spool of blue thread on top, as if it had fallen there by mistake. Tilda's eyes flicked once fast. She said loudly, "You expect me to mend this too? You've turned me into a tailor." Eliza's mother laughed nervously. Eliza shrugged as if embarrassed. Tilda huffed, grabbed the spool, stuffed it into her apron pocket and left. If a soldier had been watching, he would have seen exactly what he expected to see: women complaining about work. By noon, Mara had the fragment. By evening, the resistance had copied it and distributed the information. The coat went back to the corporal, repaired, clean, innocent. The fragment was gone, but the danger wasn't over, because now the battalion suspected something. Not about Eliza specifically, not yet, but about leakage, about information escaping. They didn't know how. They only knew that their convoy routes were being anticipated, that ambushes happened too conveniently, that bridges were sabotaged at the wrong time. Lieutenant Haller decided the answer was intimidation. On Friday inspection day, he arrived at the tailor shop. Eliza heard the boots before she saw him. The shop fell quiet the way a room does when a storm arrives. Her mother came from the back, wiping her hands on her apron. Lieutenant Haller stepped inside as if he owned the air. He was neatly dressed, pale-eyed, and too clean for a town that smelled like coal. 2 soldiers followed him. "You are the Hart women," he said. "Yes, sir," Eliza's mother replied. Haller's gaze moved over the shop. The bolts of cloth, the shelves of thread, the work table. His eyes were sharp. He didn't look at Eliza the way other soldiers did as decoration. He looked at her the way he looked at furniture, as something to be assessed. "We've had irregularities," he said. "Uniforms altered improperly. Cloth missing, buttons replaced with inferior stock." Eliza's mother opened her mouth, but Haller raised a hand. "I will inspect your work." Eliza's stomach tightened. This was it. This was the moment everything could unravel. Haller walked behind the counter without asking permission. He picked up a coat, flipped it, checked stitching, ran his fingers along seams. He opened drawers. He lifted the lid of the thread box. Eliza's mind raced. Did she miss anything? Did she burn every scrap? Did she remove every pencil mark? Her mother stood rigid, hands clasped. Eliza forced herself to breathe, slowly, like she'd been taught in school when taking exams. Then Haller found something. He lifted a spool of thread, one of the resistance spools, though Eliza had thought she'd removed them all. It was in the wrong place, tucked behind common black thread. A blue spool with a cracked label end. Yes, a tiny ink dot on the corner. Eliza's vision narrowed. Haller turned the spool in his fingers. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew it might mean something, and that was enough. "What is this?" he asked. Eliza's mother looked confused. "Thread," she said. Haller's eyes slid to Eliza. "You explain." Now here's the terrifying truth about moments like this. You don't get time to think. You don't get to step back and workshop the perfect lie. You get one heartbeat, maybe 2, and then you say something that decides your fate. Eliza did the only thing she could do. She told the truth in a way that sounded like a lie. "It's for invisible stitches," she said. Haller frowned. "Invisible stitches." Eliza nodded, keeping her voice even, almost bored. "For officers who don't want their repairs to show. The blue thread disappears on certain linings. It's a tailor trick my father taught me." She stopped herself, as if remembering she shouldn't mention her father. "We use it for delicate work." Haller held the spool up to the light. The thread looked ordinary. Stiff, perhaps, but thread can be stiff. He was not a tailor. He wanted to be in control. He wanted the answer to fit his world. Still, suspicion lingered in his face like a shadow. So Eliza did what her entire plan depended on. She created theater. She reached for a coat on the work table, an officer's coat that truly did need a hidden repair. She flipped it inside out and pointed to the lining. "See here," she said. "If I repair this with black thread, it shows. But with this," she took the blue spool, threaded a needle quickly, and made 2 small stitches in a practiced motion. "It vanishes." She held it up. Under the lamplight, the stitches blended into the lining pattern. Not perfectly invisible, but close. Enough, the kind of close enough that a man who didn't want to admit ignorance would accept. Haller leaned in, squinted, and saw what he wanted to see: proof, a demonstration, something that made him feel foolish for questioning a simple craft. He straightened. "Fine," he said, "but we will be monitoring supplies. If I find stolen materials..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Threats were the language of occupation, and everyone in the room was fluent. He dropped the spool back into the box and moved on. Eliza didn't move. She didn't blink. She held herself still until Haller and his men left the shop and the bell stopped ringing. Then her knees went weak. She gripped the edge of the table. Her mother whispered, "Eliza, what is happening?" Eliza stared at her mother, her throat tight. For a moment she almost confessed everything, but then she remembered. Confessions are gifts to your enemies. Love can be used against you. The safest way to protect someone is to keep them in the dark. So Eliza said, "Nothing, Mama, he's just trying to scare us." Her mother didn't believe her, but she wanted to. And in war, wanting to believe can be its own survival strategy. After that day, the resistance changed their method. It was too close, too risky. Eliza had proven she could improvise, but luck isn't a plan. They began using different hiding places. Inside buttons, under labels, within rolled fabric bolts. Eliza stayed involved, but more cautiously. The battalion's suspicion didn't vanish, it sharpened. Men were questioned. Laundry was watched. Mara stopped using the back door. The cell became quieter, more careful. But the intelligence that Eliza helped move mattered. It wasn't abstract. It wasn't just information. It was lives. A convoy that could have delivered weapons to a crackdown was delayed long enough for families to evacuate. A bridge guard rotation was learned, and a sabotage team crossed in the 10-minute gap when the sentry stepped away to smoke. A patrol schedule was mapped, and a courier slipped through an alley at exactly the moment boots marched elsewhere. And maybe the most important thing was not a single event, but the feeling it created. The occupiers were not omnipotent. They could be read. They could be predicted. Their control had seams, and seams can be opened. Now, here's where the story shifts, because history is cruel and doesn't always give you a neat ending. The war did not end quickly for Ridgeford. Winter came hard. Food got scarcer. The battalion rotated men, but the uniforms kept coming. Eliza kept sewing, and each time she pushed a needle through cloth, she reminded herself of the lesson her father taught her on those old survey maps. The land has patterns, and patterns can be used. In early 1944, there was a raid, not on the shop, but close enough to smell it. A neighbor's house was searched. Men were dragged into the street. Someone had talked. Someone always talks eventually, sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of hunger, sometimes because they believe the lie that cooperation buys safety. Eliza watched from behind the shop window, her hand on her mother's shoulder, and felt that old fear return, heavy and familiar. That night Mara came one last time. "We're going." "Dark," she said. "Too many eyes, too many risks." Eliza nodded. She felt relief and grief at the same time. Mara hesitated, then reached into her coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I shouldn't give you this," she whispered, "but you deserve to know." Eliza took it. It wasn't a map. Fragment. It was a short note, written in a hand Eliza recognized from childhood, her father's. Eliza's breath caught. The note was brief, so brief it felt like someone trying to fit a whole life into a few lines. It said that he was alive, that he'd been moved, that he didn't know where he was going, but he'd heard rumors of liberation pushing closer. And then, a sentence that punched through Eliza's chest like a needle. "Keep reading the land, little Liz. It will tell you where to step." Eliza pressed the note to her mouth and felt tears come, hot and sudden. Not because the war was Over because it wasn't, but because for the first time in a long time, she had a line from the person who taught her how to find patterns in chaos. Mara squeezed her shoulder. "You did good," she said. "You did more than good." Then Mara was gone, swallowed by the dark, and Eliza was left with the note and the quiet ticking of the stove. The battalion in Ridgeford never caught her. That's the strangest part. Not because she was invincible, but because the trick she used was older than war itself. She hid in plain sight, inside the assumptions of powerful men. They looked at her and saw girl, they saw seamstress, they saw service. They did not see the mind measuring roads and memorizing schedules and turning thread into a courier. And if you're wondering what happened after, if she got her father back, if she lived happily, if the town celebrated her, here's the honest answer. I don't know every detail, because stories like hers often vanish into the ordinary. That's how it goes. The world remembers generals and speeches, not the girl who kept a whole network moving from behind a counter. But we can say what matters, because it's the point of telling this story in the first place. When you think of intelligence work, you probably picture radios and code books and shadowy meetings. But sometimes intelligence is a seam. Sometimes it's a hem. Sometimes it's a spool of thread sitting in a box while an officer's fingers turn it. And the only thing standing between life and death is whether you can make him feel certain. Eliza's victory wasn't that she never felt fear. She felt it constantly. Her victory was that she learned to hold fear like fabric, tight enough that it didn't slip, loose enough that it didn't tear. She learned to speak the occupiers, language, arrogance, routine, theater, and use it against them. She learned that the smallest things can carry the heaviest weight. And maybe that's the real message here, the one that hits hard if you let it. In a world where power feels absolute, the cracks often start where power refuses to look. In the places it dismisses, in the hands it underestimates, in the jobs it thinks are harmless. So the next time you hear someone say, "What could one person do?" I want you to think of a 17-year-old seamstress with a needle and a map. I want you to think of the sound of boots on old floorboards, the smell of wool and coal, and a spool of thread that held a bridge's fate inside it. And I want you to remember this. History isn't only changed by the loud and the armed. Sometimes it's changed by the quiet girl who keeps her face calm, pulls her stitches tight, and turns in enemies.